When I was a kid, anytime you went into someone's house, on the bookshelf you'd see The Blue Spine of Oscar and Lucinda. A generation later, the same thing was true of True History of the Kelly Gang. Peter Carey is this towering figure. He's one of a tiny category of authors who's won the Booker Prize twice. Every bookshop stocks him, everybody knows his name, and yet I have this theory that Peter Carey is the most owned, least read literary writer in the Australian firmament. And I think he's less read than he ought to be. His work is meaningful and pleasurable in complicated and underestimated ways. His early short stories have this delightfully bonkers energy. His novels are dark and twisted and playful. They're not the straight historical fiction I think so many people expect from his sepia-toned covers. I often want to share his work, and so I was delighted when my friend Sarah Krasnostein started reading and loving him too, knowing I'd get to talk to her all about it. And that is what I'm going to do today. From Schwartz Media, I'm Michael Williams with Read This, a show about the books we love and the stories behind them. Sarah Krasnostein is a writer and journalist, probably best known for her incredible book, The Trauma Cleaner. Her most recent work is the Ode to Peter Carey that she's written for the Writers on Writers series.
Thank you for having me, Michael Williams.
So maybe tell me about reading True History of the Kelly Gang for the first time.
So it was probably early 2020 when we were making use of the books we had, and True History had been on my shelf for 20 years, unread. I had opened it enough to see the map at the beginning, and I don't know what it was. I just gave it a go.
Are you a map at the beginning person normally? Or was that straight away off-putting as soon as you saw the map?
It's such a writer's question. That's a beautiful question. I am nothing at the beginning except for what the author is telling me in words. So if it's even like the author's kind of prologue, I am more fixated on the first chapter. So yeah, any kind of introductory material, I normally skim over. But that map kind of snagged me because it was hand-drawn, I think, and strange.
Are you a big reader of Australian literary fiction? You know, is that something that you seek out, or is it not really your genre?
So now I am. But for the longest time, I wasn't. And I know that I sound the way that I sound, but I have lived here most of the time since 1994. I've read a lot of Australian literature, but the fiction side was something that I kind of felt a little alienated from for most of that time. And I think kind of around the time period in which I started reading Carey, something had shifted and I felt much more at home here. And I felt like those books too were speaking to me. So
I like that you've just confessed your accent is entirely an affectation. That's an important thing to reveal.
I practice with a series of tapes.
Yeah, no, I can tell. That's the deep corruption of it. I'm interested in that idea that part of being more open to it was feeling at home here. And I think one of the things that's so lovely about the way you write about Carey is you write about that idea of belonging and feeling at home or not feeling at home, outsiders and insiders. And you reflect that if you're reading about Melbourne, you'd read Helen Garner. If you're reading about Australia, you would read Alexis Wright. Yeah. What was it that you found off-putting about the idea of Carey at that point?
Yeah, I mean, no offense to you or anyone listening, but I felt like part of me assumed I had him pegged as, you know, another kind of white Aussie dude telling me what to think about this place. And I didn't really have the skin left for that anymore. I kind of wanted a different take. I was wrong. And I think that I took that point that you pointed out earlier, how broadly he had been kind of integrated into our reading life and our cultural shorthand. He's on so many bookshelves. He's in every library, every bookshop. And I mistook that for kind of an easier treatment or a less critical treatment of who we are and where we come from.
Arguably the book that most leads to this perception that Carey is uncritically reproducing the established versions of Australian history is True History of the Kelly Gang, just because it's about Ned Kelly. But Carey takes Kelly's famous Jerilderie letter as his starting point. This is the letter that was written on Ned Kelly's behalf by his friend Joe Byrne, to try and exonerate him in the public eye for the blame the newspapers were heaping on him. It's a defence of his actions, and it helps us understand him on his own terms. I want to focus now on Kelly Gang, because that was the first one that you read.
Yes.
And you talk a bit about the opening sentence. Yeah, I'm going to ask you to read the opening sentence.
Okay. I lost my own father at 12 years of age, and know what it is to be raised on lies and silences, my dear daughter. You are presently too young to understand a word I write, but this history is for you and will contain no single lie. May I burn in hell if I speak false. It's so good.
It's pretty fabulous, but it's voice immediately.
Yes.
Like when people talk about that book, because Carey made the decision to, in what is often referred to as an act of ventriloquism, take the voice in Kelly's Jerilderie letter and make that the voice for the book.
Yes.
What grabbed you about that?
So it presents like optically as just radical because it's unpunctuated and it just goes on and that whole page goes on and on. But that voice in that book is so powerful. It's so direct. You hear it speaking to you, even though it's speaking, at a remove to a daughter. It just blew me away. And that lack of punctuation, I mean, it's a radical move for a writer. It's a radical move for an editor or a house to kind of back that. But the tone of it, the emotional force of it just kind of blasts from the page in the same way that the original kind of letter does. So, it's very rare that I have such a strong emotional reaction to the kind of technique. And I think that's because it so beautifully matches the content.
Once you got past that first sentence, was that just it? Compulsive reading?
Yeah, no, I was completely on board. And speaking so frankly and almost kind of grittily about a history that we have polished into caricature. And so I found that so comfortable and welcoming to kind of speak frankly about something. And all under the guise of this very popular author that, you wouldn't have expected something like that from him.
How did it challenge that expectation of it being another white, middle-aged male voice lecturing you about Australian history? I mean, as far as a choice of subject matter goes, it's Carey playing into that expectation. This is myth-building, What is it about the way he tackles that material that transcends some of that nonsense?
So it's a Trojan horse, the story, the use of it, all of the injustice that is there if you think about it for 2 seconds, but we don't think about in our myths and songs and all the rest of it. And so if we're talking about Commonwealth history, he really is at every turn making clear the lie in the name of the Commonwealth, that this was very much a lawless society in which some benefited by virtue of privilege, others benefited by virtue of force, and what happened to those left behind, and why, therefore, do we continue to kind of have this adulation, or some of us anyway, for Ned Kelly, who was in the end a cop killer and a thief.
So obviously you had preconceptions about Carey. What preconceptions did you have about Ned Kelly before you tackled this book?
So for the longest time, it was just some vague understanding that there was a cowboy figure with a bucket type armor on his head, and we continue to kind of have this binary view of Ned Kelly, the man and or the myth. On one side, he's either, the cop-killing horse thief and good for nothing, and why would we idolize an outlaw and a criminal? And on the other side, he really does stand for righteous defiance against unjust authority. And I think, when you look at where he came from as a child, when you look at the self-interests of the media, the kind of structure of colonial justice and colonial politics, no one's hands were clean in that situation. His trial wasn't fair. His arrest and his detainment weren't 100% kosher. And so there's much to be sympathetic with, even if you yourself have not had, similar experiences of that degree. And I think that's why the kind of crew that's united in favor of Ned Kelly or still moved or emotionally interested or attracted to him has certain things in common.
Do you think if Ned Kelly were around in 2023, he'd be an anti-vaxxer?
He would be. He'd be waving that
I
fucking...
just kind of think he would. The
don't
whole
tread on
sovereign
me
citizen
flag.
thing,
Yes.
like it's...
It's true.
No,
It's
I
true.
definitely feel it. He would.
He would. He really would.
Coming up after the break, Sarah Krasnostein goes digging to find out what drove Peter Carey's fascination with Ned Kelly. That's next. Welcome back. Sarah Krasnostein has this way of excavating her subject matter. Whether it's about the nature of trauma, or why we believe what we believe, or getting beneath stories about the isolated and the lost in our society, she digs and digs until she can tell you something new about something you thought you already understood. And in her new book on Peter Carey, she does it again, mining his history growing up in the Victorian town of Bacchus Marsh, reading through his archive, and retracing his life to make sense of his work. And of course, the obvious place to start when you're thinking about true history of the Kelly gang is the infamous Sidney Nolan portraits. Sarah wanted to understand how these amazing images of Ned Kelly served as an inspiration for Peter Carey's work.
You know, I always am so interested in the genesis of the book and the way in which the material stays with you for often years before you start writing. And he had spoken about going to see the Kelly series as a young man, just I think it was 20 or 21, and the impact that they had on him, and going off and, you know, looking at the Jerilderie letter after that, transcribing it and literally carrying it around in his pocket, which says a lot about the kind of a young dude he was. Nothing happened. He did not kind of use it to write the bushranger novel that he had been kind of playing with for another 20 years. And then he's in New York City in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there was the Nolan exhibit there. And he kind of had this moment of realizing that, you know, he could start writing this book, or he still needed to write that book. And so kind of the visual to the written is another interesting aspect.
What was it about those Nolan images that most unlocked the story for him?
So it's interesting to speculate, and I think he has said, you know, that he was so kind of moved by it that he progressively took all of his American mates to the museum and around the exhibition and was explaining to them why this bushranger occupies the kind of national, collective emotional terrain usually occupied by statesmen or war heroes. I think what was going on was that he was kind of finding his feet in a new culture. These powerful paintings were something from home that you could be so proud of. You know, Nolan, again, has a background similar to Carey, coming from working class parents, son of a tram driver. And he has painted these images that are worthy of standing in of the world's finest art museums by themselves. And so I think there's that pride. There's looking at the receptivity of an American audience and knowing that, you know, yes, it is worthwhile. And then that he's explaining, above all, to himself why we have this kind of layered and complex, enduring relationship with Ned Kelly, or the archetype of Ned Kelly.
Yeah. I'm just curious about the writing of a book like this. You know, you had the full trajectory from had him on the shelves but skeptical about him, read him and loved him, and suddenly you're a Carey aficionado and you have to kind of find a way to sum up his work and his role in the Australian literary canon on the page. How do you approach that even from a research perspective?
So I've learned now to kind of trust the panic and the real hesitation that I feel in the face of certain things that don't make sense or that I find confusing or confronting. That's where the gold will be in the end, if I can just sit with that and kind of unpack it. So the terror with a book like this is, how do you possibly say something new about a writer so familiar and so well covered in the cultural mind? I try to never start with the secondary sources, what's been written. I try to go back, put myself as close to the material as I can. And in this instance, that meant going to physically have a look at Bacchus Marsh and see kind of if I could make out the shape of what the town looked like in the 40s or 50s. It's something that I'm always doing anyway in Melbourne, and I also do it to some degree in New York. I try to find the shape of the old city because I find the history fascinating anyway. And I thought, it might at least place me geographically where he is from. The light looks the same. The shape of the landscape, will look the same. Everything else is different. But maybe there'll be something there that can function as some way in. So that's how I started.
You've got a beautiful line in your book about Carey where you talk about our compensatory myths or lies or half-truths as that being a kind of important bit of national and literary kind of identity that happens. That's obviously most explicit in Carey's work in True History of the Kelly Gang, but I'm curious for you as a reader, having resisted him all this time and then discovered you loved this book. Do you remember where you went next in your Carey reading?
Yeah. So I did the short stories and then Oscar and Lucinda.
There's something about going back to those early short stories and the kind of madness of them. Like he's much more playful and anarchic early in his career before he develops kind of discipline. That plays there in all his work. But those early short stories are deliciously bonkers.
They're wild. And it's funny because he's a similar age to Helen Garner. They're writing those first big books at the same time. And they are like nothing else kind of in that mid-70s milieu. And so there is a sense, and again, I think Nolan has this as well, that they are cultural orphans. They come from a tradition that's kind of English, an English literary tradition and those influences, but they have no local forebears. And so, these are wild stories. They're young men's stories. The women are particularly not well fleshed out, but they are so undeniably good and full of potential that, you just stick with them. And many of them contain the themes that he would later elaborate on at length in these weighty tomes.
You talk about those themes that run through his work really beautifully. I'm sorry to read to you, which is a cardinal sin, but it's in front of me. So it's he decants the enormous sweep of colonial history into finely observed domestic details, serving it up on a human scale. His themes: the violence pulsing just below the skin of good order, outsiders, outcasts and orphans, shame and its defences, betrayal, risk, denial and other contortions that the psyche performs to avoid threats to its preferred self-concept. And also something I could reduce to the words freedom or joy. It's a really lovely accounting of what he comes back to again and again in his work. And I'd like you just to reflect for a second on another point you make about his themes, which is that he's an intensely political writer.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people miss that about Carey. In what way would you characterize him as political?
Yeah, so he is kind of always writing very directly about all of the things that we'd rather forget. So the kind of original violence of colonization, the way that kind of brutality and the erasure of it has warped politics since. The fawning response to American foreign policy that has stayed with us since at least the Whitlam years. And I would say kind of the way in which that's fed into a particular conception of the media in the later years, starting from the 90s. And it's interesting because something like Amnesia, which, looks at the complicity of the media in certain forms of politics. Some people have pointed out that he's anticipated things that are now just, taken for granted. And he has a wicked sense of humor. I mean, it's just laugh out loud, funny a lot of the time, but has a sense of the absurd for political purposes, which is very effective.
in the early days of the internet, there was a website I really liked called The Fame Audit, which would take celebrities and basically ask whether they were the right level of famous, whether they should be more famous or less famous.
Oh, my gosh.
Now that you're a great proselytizer for Peter Carey, and I imagine you just in bookshops buying multiple copies to thrust in people's hands, do you think his status in the Australian literary firmament is appropriate? Do you think he's underestimated?
Well, he got there in the end, and who knows whether for the right reasons or not. But I think that many of the people who own him or claim to have read him or like him would be quite startled at finding, what those books are actually saying. Oscar and Lucinda is, radical in, many of the kind of challenges it poses to the original Sydney settlement. It would be quite discomforting, I think, to a lot of people that think he's just, a nice Aussie author.
One of the rationales behind the Writers on Writers series is about influence and finds kind of writers reflecting on the ways in which other people's work shapes their approach to what they do. Have you changed as a writer since becoming a Carey fan?
Look, I do not talk publicly much about this at all, but I continue to tinker with my fiction. And I have found the way he writes and the kind of volume of his output to be deeply inspiring. First, the way he writes at the sentence level is endlessly inspiring, and kind of he shows the potential of influence because he is working often from 19th century influences and using them in novel ways. And so I think that was, eye-opening in many respects. And then the endless invention, I think a writer at a certain point, we have these fears that everything has already been done. Generally and both specifically, and how are you going to find something new to write about or to say about anything? And when you see a writer who has, that high volume output and that quality of output, it's very reassuring. So I've found his work to be heartening in those respects.
We can't wait to read Sarah Krasnostein's fiction, and when it's out, you'll hear about it here. Her book on Peter Carey is part of the Black Ink Writers on Writers series and is widely available now. And if you're in Melbourne, Sarah will also be appearing at the State Library of Victoria. That's happening on Friday the 1st of September at 6:30pm, and she's going to be discussing the book with friend of the show, Professor Tony Birch. Registrations are free, but capacity is limited. You need to head to the link in our show notes to book your tickets. And if you're listening to this after September 1st, you can't go. You've missed it. It's in the past. That's how time works. Before we go, in lieu of the normal what I've been reading this week, we thought in honour of Sarah's conversation about Peter Carey, I would just flag my favourite 2 Peter Carey books that I would steer you to once you're done with True History of the Kelly Gang. The first is Jack Maggs. It won the Miles Franklin Award, and it's Carey's retelling of Great Expectations from the perspective of the convict. And then his early book of short stories, The Fat Man in History. It's an absolute cracker. You can find these books and all the others we've talked about today at your favourite local independent bookstore. Or, if you want to listen to an audiobook, you can head to the Read This reading room on Apple Books at apple.co/readthis. It's regularly updated with all the books we talk about every week. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends about it and rate and review us. It helps us a lot. Read This is produced by Clara Ames and edited by Sarah McVie. Original compositions are by Zoltan Fecho, and the mixing is by Travis Evans. Thanks for listening. See you next week.